So we're talking all about like podcast guesting and the right ways to do it, ways to make profit from it, and all the things. Now, the stigma out there, and actually one of the ways I even teach to grow is to have long form content. Like
Mhm.
have a podcast, have a blog, have a YouTube channel, something where your content can live on. But I know that one of the things that you teach too is that you don't even have to own the podcast. You don't have to own a YouTube channel in order to have evergreen content work for you. And I think that will be like a relief to a lot of people going, I'm not ready to have like weekly content and a content calendar and all the things. So, can you tell us a little bit about that and why you believe you can grow without having your own podcast or long form content?
Yeah, in fact, whether it's LinkedIn or a conference, typically if someone walks in the room next to me, if anyone does recognize me, which is rare, but if someone did recognize me, they'd be like, "Oh, that's Dustin. He's the podcast guy, right?" And so I've kind of got this moniker, and so it's very common. It happens several times a week where I'll get an inbound message or a referral, and someone will be like, "Oh, Gabe's thinking about starting a podcast. I thought she should talk to you." And I get on a call, and I'm like, "Here's my first piece of advice: don't start a podcast." To your point, I actually think it's a huge mistake to start a podcast, except when you're at sort of a certain point in this journey. And to give people context, like, why would I say that? Because I actually have a podcast. Well, I did not have a podcast. So it was the first 3.5 years that I was involved in podcasting. And that's where this podcast guesting side of the mic comes in. So for me, I got into this actually for a whole different business that was a physical products business and literally selling meat sticks to strangers on the internet. I certainly wasn't going to start a podcast about that, but what I did do was I started coming out of COVID and changes to our business reality as I started going on and telling the brand story and creating long form educational content about why our brand mattered and why it was different and our foundational story and some of these kind of things. And I found that like, oh, podcast guesting is really effective. And then people started noticing that and they started asking me how I was doing it. And then I created this whole 7 figure leap brand that we're talking about or brought me here today. So long story short, it wasn't just for this business, but for these two brands, I did only podcast guesting for 3.5 years, grew two 7 figure brands, all before I ever had a podcast. So that's
Mm.
sort of an extreme example. But typically what I tell people is like, go be a guest. Other people are already doing the work. They've got an audience. They've built relationships. You can go plug into that and leverage that to grow your own business. And only when you know exactly what you want to talk about, the hooks that people care about, your lead magnets, your messaging, only when you're way down this spectrum should you even think about starting a podcast. And that's certainly still not required. But yeah, so I'd say like guest at least 20 times before you even think about starting a podcast because it's a huge commitment. It does have its own benefits. There's a reason I do it, but guessing is way easier. And for 90% of the creators I talk to, I'm like, just guess. Like, don't even bother with the hosting side.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's still evergreen. All of your
Mhm.
episodes are out there living on other people's episodes that people can still find you and you can gain that visibility and you have your lead magnets out there and all the things, but you don't have the pressure of the weekly content. So I love the idea of starting there and then you can like hone your messaging and hone what you want to talk about. And I mean, like for to give reference, I started my podcast before I did too much podcast guesting, and I've changed my name of my podcast 3 times, right? Because I didn't
Exactly.
know out. So you
Yes.
would have
And
saved me that headache.
yeah, and I didn't luckily I didn't start a podcast. So I changed the brand of this company about a year ago. Right, it was actually about the time I started the podcast. I was like, now I'm ready to know what the brand should actually be called and start a podcast. But that was 18 months, 24 months into getting paid for coaching in this space. So yeah, I think that's it. And that's the reality for almost everyone. So long story short, like if you're like, man, I want long form content and I believe in this sort of teaching cells philosophy. If I could teach and do long form educational content, that'd be awesome. You can totally do that on other people's platforms and they'll love you for it because you're going to come on and fill a void or fill a niche that they're not ever going to do. And it's, we're going to talk about all the benefits, but there's so many other reasons to do guesting. Yeah, hopefully that just comes as like a piece for people because almost everyone I meet, their default thought when they hear podcasting is, "Oh, I got to start a podcast." I'm like, "No, you do not, and you probably should not."
Did you hear that? You probably should not if you don't have one already. Wow,
Yes.
I love it. And I love like breaking the myths, like the norms of what you're supposed to do, like breaking those myths and going, let's do business differently. This is one
Mhm.
of those ways that you can do business differently. It's about what works for you in the capacity you have in the season you're in of business and all the things. Now, I want to touch a little bit on social media versus podcast guesting and kind of what are the benefits of it versus focusing so much on the social media marketing side.
Great question. I mean, the things that come to mind immediately are what we started with. Is it's a long form educational channel. YouTube, you can do some of that, right? But for the most part, when people think social media, they think Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest. They're like in and out, in and out, in and out. Like you little micro doses of content, and then they disappear, right? And so with podcasting, you get this long form place to express yourself. Plus, it's evergreen, so it doesn't disappear immediately, and you can still break it up into smaller snippets if you want, right? So it sort of gives you the clay by which you can build lots of little projects with the content. So from a content generation standpoint, I think that's one of the huge differences. I would say the other big difference is it's a form of marketing that's by invite and not by interruption. And so if you think like, how do you discover someone's content on Facebook or TikTok or whatever? It's because you're scrolling through and you get interrupted by something, and maybe it gets your attention enough to like, have an impression. Whereas podcasting or podcast guesting, as we're talking about it, if I listen to a podcast, I know the name of the show, the episode topic. I probably have listened to other episodes from this host, so there's some implicit trust. I'm probably going to download it to a device. I'm probably going to listen to it in a semi hypnotic state when I'm running or taking care of my kids or whatever, right? And so it's just a completely different dynamic of how you're interacting with the other humans. It tends to be lower volume than some of the social media, but way higher quality because people are investing way more time into your individual content. And like I said, they're coming to it voluntarily and not through interruption. I'd say those are like the main things that come to mind, contrasting the two.
Yeah, podcasting, I feel like you can really build a relationship more and build
Yeah.
trust more quickly than with social media. Now, I know you use with your clients a 5P podcast guesting framework. Can you
Yes.
walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll rattle them off real fast and I'll go back to each one individually and just kind of give a synopsis. So, five P's. So, purpose, plan, pitch, perform, and profit. So, if people are jotting those things down, so purpose is basically the point. It's the step that most people skip, and it's being able to answer very clearly, why do I want to be a podcast guest? So who's my ideal client? What's my KPI I want to drive with this? Like what's the result I want to get? What words am I going to use? I'm a story brand guide. So we get into people's messaging and their one-liner and how they introduce themselves. That's all in step one. And it's just getting really clear on like, why do I want to do this in the first place? Then
Mhm.
step two, which is where most people think they should start, is plan. And that's just a way of saying research or planning for which shows do I want to be on. So the step two is about identifying the right types of podcasts that I'd want to be a guest on. Step three, once we know which shows we want to be on, is pitch. And that's how do I get on them? So it's writing a compelling, warm, cool, win-win-win crafted message. I'm using all these adjectives to say it's not a cold pitch, like, and we can break this down more. But the pitch is, "Hey, Gabe, you have an awesome podcast. Here's how I can be an asset to your audience. I'd love to come on and serve." And that's what we're doing in step three. And then they say yes. So step four is pitch or is perform. So they've said yes to the pitch. Perform is kind of the art and science of how to be a good interviewee. So, how do you show up, introduce yourself, tell the right story, use the right words, have a strong call to action so that every time you get a chance to interview, you leave a really positive impression and, get leads for your business. And then step five is profit. So, this is my favorite part. A lot of people in the podcasting space focus on getting people on podcasts, right? So, hey, I'm a booking agency. You pay me $2,000 a
Mhm.
month. I'm going to get you on 4 podcasts. They skip the purpose part about the strategy and targeting and why we want to do this. And then there's nothing on the leverage part or the profit part about what are we going to do with each of these appearances to leverage it and grow our business with it. And so the stuff in the middle is kind of the common finding shows, pitching shows, and performing. We sort of bookend it with really intentional strategy on how we're selecting the opportunities. And then we do a lot of work. Like we were on a 90-day program 60 of the 90 days is on the profit part. So
Mm.
just to give people context, like it's one thing to get on the right shows, tell the right stories. There's so much opportunity after that that people miss because they're not intentional about what to do with the podcast opportunities that they get. So
Okay, I want to dive deeper into a few of these aspects, especially the ones that we don't talk about as much. I mean, we talk about pitching a lot here, but like actually being prepared for the interview. What do you do in the interview? Those things. I really want to dive into that. I want to talk a little bit about finding interviews, like finding podcasts, because I know I get pitched every day, multiple times. And it's funny to me because I get pitched really weird niches. I'm like,
yeah.
that's not anything that my business does. You obviously haven't done your homework. So, do you have any like quick tips for those who want to guest podcast on finding the right podcast and not having to take hours to do the research?
Yeah, I'll start with sort of a framework, and then we can talk about a tool that But like the framework, the mindset here is if you're listening to this on audio, just think of like two circles, right? And this is like a classic Venn diagram. So one of those circles is your area of expertise. So it's like, here's the thing I'm an expert at. And the other circle is the host of the podcast and their area of expertise, right? So you don't want two circles that don't touch at all, because then you get what Gabe just experienced. Like, why would I interview someone about underwater basket weaving? Like, this has no relevance to my audience. But you also don't want the circles to completely overlap, where you're coming on and basically competing with the host, and like that doesn't make sense. So you want a Venn diagram where there's some overlap but not too much. And so, like, the way I like to frame this for people, we'll use like marriage coaching as an example. If I'm a marriage coach, I don't want to go be on all the podcasts hosted by marriage coaches, because, again, it's kind of like, well, it's redundant or we're going to conflict and I'm trying to take their clients. So, what I want to think about is, if I do marriage coaching, two questions: what causes people to need it, and then what symptoms arise from that issue, right? And so what causes people to have some marriage issues and seek a marriage coach? Well, as one example of many, would be like being a first time parent, right? Hell, if you're a first time parent, it creates a lot of new issues in your schedule and sleep and communication. So maybe I'm a marriage coach who goes and gets on podcasts that cater to first time parents. And I'm not trying to be the parenting coach, the sleep coach, the breastfeeding coach, or whatever they all talk about. I'm just the marriage expert who comes on and talks to the audience, right? Another example the other way, like, what symptoms happen when someone's having marriage problems? Well, one could be financial difficulties, right? And so maybe I become the marriage coach, but I get on shows focused on personal finance, budgeting, and I come on and I'm saying, hey, for the couples in the audience, here's how you communicate, set goals together, dream together. And that's going to actually be a compliment to the CPA or whoever, the financial planner who's hosting that podcast. So it's a very quick example, but the basic idea is you're going to fill a content gap and not try to either replace the host or come out of left field and have something that has no relevance. So that's like the strategy, Gabe. And then um, tool wise, like, one I can throw out really simply for people is listennotes.com. If they go to listennotes.com, it's free. It's basically like Google for podcast. So if you put in like Dustin Riekman, you're going to see every show I've ever guested on or hosted on. But if you put in first time parenting, you're going to find a bunch of podcasts about that topic. So it's very robust, a little overwhelming, but it's also a cool free tool for people.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. I've heard of Listen Notes. I've used it a little bit, but I forget about that tool too.
Yeah.
So I like the idea of them complementing each other. They kind of mesh in some way, but we're looking at those that we can serve in a different way too. So you're filling gaps in those podcasts as well.
Yeah.
So love that. And as far as purpose goes, I think knowing why we're going on that podcast, like what is the reason? Is it kind of like what's our CTA to? What is the
Yes.
intention? What are we doing to serve? And why are we doing it? Kind of a thing. Is that kind of what the purpose side of things is?
Yeah, it's kind of multifaceted, but yes, what you said is definitely part of it. Is like beginning with the end in mind, right? So
Hmm.
before I even can select, before I want to go on a first time parenting podcast, I would need to know, would I have a call to action at the end of that that would make sense for me to get marriage coaching clients, right? And so it's sort of a circular, iterative argument in a way. But yeah, so part of purpose is, what's my whole goal? Like, am I trying to sell books, get clients, grow as seen on logos on my website? Like, there's lots of reasons to do podcast guesting. I think for me and for you and for most of your audience here, it's probably mostly getting clients. and therefore you want to think about what's the lead magnet call to action that's going to lead people into my sales process. Like, so we'll get clear on that. But to peel that onion one layer further, to answer that, many people are actually not very clear on who they serve and what the transformation is that they provide, right? And so the very first exercise we do a little story brand exercise, and then we do this really simple thing that people can do for themselves in our main program, where we start. We call it the before and after transformation matrix. It's literally draw draw a vertical line on a piece of paper and put before on the left side and after on the right side, and then put have, feel, average day, and status, and just answer before anyone ever meets me or knows anything about what I do, how do they feel about the thing that I help with before? And then once they fully experienced my transformation, they did all the coaching with me and took my program, how do they feel after? What do they have before and after? What's their average day like? And what's their status, or how they would describe their reality and our label in life? Then you've got some really powerful um, perspective on, like, okay, like, where do people who are experiencing this feeling, this status, where do they listen and hang out? And then that makes it way more obvious about which podcast to guest on. And then when you're on there, we also use that in that perform part, because we want to use those words in our interview, because we want to call out to those people in their before state so we can talk about how we can bring them to the after state with our transformation. So that's a pretty deep answer, Gabe, but these are sequential, but they all tie together, right? So it's not like you
Yeah.
can talk about one in isolation. And so hopefully that was helpful and not confusing about how we think about purpose.
Yeah, no, it's helpful. And I'm going to lean that into the performance in a second too.
Okay.
But when it comes to the pitch, I know like I was saying, we talk about the pitch a lot because podcasters get pitched dozens, if not hundreds of podcast guests every day.
Yes.
And so, how in the world do you stand out to that? Like, how do you create a pitch that's actually going to get noticed? So, I'd love to hear what has worked for you and your clients to really get noticed and get on these really big show because you've been on really big shows, you know?
Yeah. And I'll first say that you can butter your bread, make a living, do really well without ever being on a big show. So I've
Mhm.
been on some pretty cool shows of late through relationships, but the whole Fire Creek Snacks saga, a journey, chapter, and then basically everything up to seven figures with this coaching business happened through small and medium sized podcasts. So I hope that's encouraging to people. Like, you're probably not going to get on Amy Porterfield. You're probably not getting on Joe Rogan, and you don't need to. Like, I haven't been on that big of shows, but even all the shows that I've been on that I would consider larger opportunities were after I had that level of sort of coaching acumen or success. So you
Mhm.
don't have to get on big shows, but to your point, even before I had a podcast, I got pitched on. I got pitched from guests every day because it's just people are spraying and praying, right? They're just cold pitches, it's icky, gross, and that comes in emails and DMs and everything else. So how do you stand out, and how do you actually get a positive response from most of the hosts? You don't do that. So it requires more work, and we actually will send a warm outreach instead of a cold outreach. And if people want to kind of envision this, one of the free things we're going to give away at the end of the interview is actually our template for this, like a literal Google Doc that will help them write this. But if they want to kind of envision it, it's three pieces, and just think of it as an email for simplicity's sake. The first piece is really critical. It's like the relational anchors. So this is the first thing the person's going to receive and read after the subject line, and it's going to actually be a personal connection to them and their podcast, right? And so lots of examples that we'll give them in those templates. But just imagine you receive this and you're like, oh, this is actually a human, and that is literally the whole role of this. Is you're not a weirdo from the internet. You're a human. You actually know something about me that's not too much. Like, you don't want to be creepy, but you want to be like respectful. And so that's sort of a art and science piece of this, but that's really critical, and that's got to be custom in every single outreach. Then the middle part of the email, which is the most labor intensive but completely recyclable, is the what's in it for them. So this is a bullet point summary of how you're going to serve their audience and be a huge win to the host and to their audience, and how this is like such a cool way for you to show up and give. So it's all about them. It's not about you. I'm a story brand guide, right? And so nowhere in here I've even mentioned my name. It's like, Gabe, you're awesome. I got this unique value from your podcast in this specific way. then it transitions into like, I'd love to serve your audience, and here's some bullet points of how I think this interview could go. And you're going to read those and be like, wow, that's really good because they're copywritten, they're well done. And then the last part of this email is the close, which is simply a very clear ask. I know you get a lot of pitches, and probably most of them are icky. I would love to come on and serve your audience in the way I shared above. Are you interested, Dustin? Without a one sheet, without a pitch, and I'm writing this as Dustin, not as a PR company who says Dustin's God's gift to Gabe, and you'd be so lucky to have him on your show and all that stuff. So in summary, a custom relational anchor that's real. The middle of the email is a value statement of bullet point summary that you can recycle over and over and over again as long as you stay in the same target market. And then a very clear, simple, hard to say no to ask like, are you interested? And so we want to create that as a master email. We may send it as an email, but we may also send it as a direct message, but we'll only send the first part as a direct message. So it's like you're not going to send this whole email. But if I connect with you on LinkedIn and we've had a little pleasantry conversation, then I may say, by the way, I think you're awesome, and here's like this value I got from your LinkedIn post or your podcast, and then I'll say something like, I have an idea for your podcast. Is it okay if I send that to you? And then you say yes. And I was like, cool. And then I send the bullet points, right? And then you say,
Mm.
those are really cool. And I say, are you interested in having me on? And so a DM's the same thing. It's just in snippets. And then the final thing, I'll be quiet about this. But this is obviously a point of passion. You can do the same thing in a video. And so imagine you get a Loom video, and it's, hey Gabe, and I've got your website up or your podcast up, and I'm pointing to like, this episode was freaking awesome and it changed my life, and here's how. And I have some ideas that for your show, where I think I could add value. Would it be okay if I sent those to you? And it's literally me on video, not AI. And I could do that with a screen share. I could do that as a selfie, on my phone. Like that would be kind of a next level way to do a pitch. So there's much more we can talk about, Gabe, but like hopefully gives you or gives your listeners a framework and sort of some more advanced ways to apply it. So
Yeah. Okay. I love a lot of things about that. I haven't gotten a video pitch yet. I love that idea. Just doing something
yeah,
really
how would you
simple.
stand out? It's like, well,
Yeah.
hey
And you're
Gabe, this is
asking
my
questions.
name's Dustin, and like I was thinking, I've been nervous to send you this, but I just had
Mhm.
something on my mind I wanted to share, and like we're connected in this way, or you posted this thing, or I saw that you interviewed Joe, and Joe and I actually connected a while back, and he said something that really impacted me and how my relationship with my wife or whatever, like legit real stuff. But yeah, imagine getting a personalized video. It's gonna be way harder to say no now if they still don't have anything of value and it's still not good, you're still not obligated to say yes, but it's going to open the door and make you pay attention to it versus the rapid delete that you probably do with almost all of these pitches that come your way. So
Yeah, makes total sense. And now that I say that, I did get one video. It wasn't about being on the podcast. It was about speaking at an event. Actually sent me a Loom video and it's like, I was thinking about you. I had like three confirmations that you're supposed to speak at this live event. And it like hit me a lot because I'm going, oh man, now I have to think about this. I was saying hard no's to a lot of things, but this is really personal. And I can tell that she put a lot of thought into it. And now I'm speaking at her live event in Nashville in September. Right.
there
And
you
so
go.
like, works the same on a podcast. And I love that you weren't like, let's go dive deep into all the things. Let's keep it simple. Like make it
Yeah.
really short and sweet and personable and sign your own name. Like I
Mhm.
actually don't really say yes to anything that comes from a PR.
I
I
don't
want
either.
it to come personal from somebody. So, I mean, like a big show, maybe like if Amy Porterfield had someone reach out to say, can I be on your podcast? Sure, maybe I would say yes, right?
Yes.
But like I just even if you're a bigger business, I prefer that personal touch because then I know that's what I'm going to get on my podcast as well.
Yeah, and the dynamic there, just to kind of draw the line between where I think it'd be appropriate for it to be a third party versus the person is basically, do you have celebrity status in your market, right? Like if I don't know, Matthew McConaughey says he wants to be on the Seven Figure Elite podcast, I would expect his agent to reach out and say, Matthew is listening to your show and he'd love to come on, and be like, heck yeah, right? But unless you're like a celebrity in your niche, that feels really weird and it feels impersonal. And so for 99% of us mortals, like you should send it as yourself and you would want to receive it from someone as themselves. Like it's just it doesn't smell right when a PR agency is pitching someone you have never heard of, and they're like, again, they're really setting them up with this weird status that just feels like they're talking down to you instead of talking like how can they serve your audience, which is the posture that we really want people to have.
Mhm. Yeah, I love telling me what you're going to do for my audience, not what it's going to do for you.
Yes.
And so I'd love to like dive a little bit into now you get the pitch, you get the pitch. You've pitched, you get the interview, you're booked. What are your top tips for making that podcast interview truly engaging and valuable for that audience? And
Mhm.
then we'll dive into kind of like, and then how do you make profits from that as well?
The good part. Yeah, as far as the perform, you know, there's lots of elements of course, that we do mock interviews with clients, all that kind of stuff. But kind of the really basic things that people could take away if they had an interview tomorrow and do well: introduction, story, and call to action, right? And so, introduction is sort of a one liner, right? So someone's like, "Hey, Dustin, welcome to the show. Please tell us what you do." Don't start in fifth grade and then you had a stepfather and then you went off on this camp and like, oh my gosh, like, problem, solution, benefit. So I solved this problem and with for my clients with it in this way, and it creates these great benefits. It takes 15 to 20 seconds to say that. And if they want, like, oh, I'd love to know more about your childhood because that's like something relevant. Great. They can ask you more, but like people screw up the introduction. So if you just have a very concise, simple introduction that you can practice in the mirror, it's your elevator pitch, right? Same thing, you shake someone's hand at a conference. A very simple one liner like that, problem, solution, benefit. Do that. And then if you do that in the opening of the interview, your pulse goes down, the host pulse goes down because it's like, oh, that was like now we're right into the flow, and that was so easy, and it's going to set the right tone. So that's the intro, and then once you're into it, of course, it's a conversation, so don't put too much pressure on it. But what you want to do to be an effective guest that's going to later lead to a client is you want to tell stories. And you want to tell stories that are compelling and position you as a guide to your ideal client, right? And so, the simple way to think about that is have at least one story. We like to get people up to about three stories kind of in their bag that they can pull out. So, true stories, your first story is probably going to be about yourself. And it's probably going to be your own sort of hero's journey, your own transformation. It doesn't have to be, it could be about a client. But what you want to do in that story is start with empathy and then back it up with authority. And so, going all the way back into step one with the purpose, we got that before and after matrix, right? If they're like, hey, Dustin, tell us about your coaching and what you do. I want to tell a story, and I'm not going to do that here for the interest of time, but I would start that story by being like, I know how it feels to, so let's say it's marketing. I know how it feels to have your whole business be completely dependent on referrals, wake up one day and have it all vanish. That happened to me in 2020 in the face of COVID. And it was super painful and whatever, I cried myself to sleep, and my dog, hated me or whatever. Like, you have like empathy for the people that are experiencing that. And I overcame it. I found the way, and then like now I'm on the other side of it, and I've helped 20 other people solve this problem, and it's like my life's work now. I love helping people solve that same problem. Empathy and authority. You can have one really good core story. What that's so important about that is it meets people where they're at. They're going to remember you because you're going to connect to their emotions in that before state. And they're going to be like, Andy could help me with that because he talked about the after state and the authority he has to solve this problem. That's there's a lot more to that, but that's a good basic story framework. And then the final thing I would say that's the most important part of the interview is the call to action. So you do all this work, like who would I want to serve, which podcast I want to be on. I write a pitch, they say yes. I get on, I don't make a fool of myself. The interview goes well, and I get to the end, and the host says, "Now, Dustin, for people that want to learn more, what should they do next?" And then people are
Mhm.
like, "Oh, I got an Instagram and a Facebook and an email list, and I was on this one show this one time. If you want to go Google that," and like, it's like, no, have one clear call to action that is compelling and it's consistent with the thing you've been teaching, and it lets anonymous people raise their hand and say, I do want to know more. This is, again, there's a whole nother, we could do a whole session on this, but the simple answer on this is it's a lead magnet. It's generally a free thing, that is going to be consistent with the thing you've been teaching about, and it's going to let people raise their hand and say, I want to know more from you. But just have one, make it really easy to say, repeat, have a URL that's really easy for people to memorize because, again, they're probably, feeding their kid and walking their dog and listening to listening on their headphones out on a walk, and so you can't expect too much of them.
I love it. And what I love about it is it's one clear call to action. It's not, I'm on TikTok here and I'm on Instagram here. And why don't you check out my YouTube channel? And oh, by the way, I might have a resource, right? So
Yes.
I think that's really great to have that clear call to action because it will convert way better than doing the other, like throw up all the places that you are.
Yeah.
Now, from that CTA to making profit, what is your strategy from the interview as leads come in order to actually grow your business?
Yeah. So I need 60 days to answer this question because, as I said, we do spend 2 months on this. So there's a lot to it, Gabe. But the concept here that I think people can really envision, I'm a big Nathan Barry fan, and it's a flywheel. And so the idea is you do your interview and it feeds into this flywheel, and people envision, just think of like a circle with a bunch of wedges in it, and you can kind of put in whatever wedges fit well for you and your business, but the wedges available to you are to let this interview grow your email list, create some direct sales, create some long tail residual sales. And then kind of the right side of the flywheel is the most important part, and this is the part that's going to be hard to unpack in this format. Is how do you use that podcast interview to grow high quality relationships at scale? And so the wedges in the kind of relational side of the wheel are the host, the other guests that have been on this show, and of course, the listeners. And then kind of the bottom of the wheel is content repurposing and like authority. And so one interview can kind of run its way around the wheel, right? And so you get a little bit bigger email list. You may make a direct sales. You may get some long tail sales from this being published and having SEO value and all the things that come with that. And you'll definitely develop a relationship with the host if you do it right. You'll definitely develop a relationship with the guests. And this is the part I think I want to double tap on to kind of give immediate value to people. And then you'll have all this content to repurpose, which increases your authority. And with more authority, the next rotation around here, you can be on bigger podcasts. It's easier to get a yes because you've done it before and you've got more standing in the marketplace, right? And so you talked before, like, yeah, I've gotten on some bigger shows because I've got much more authority because I've done this 100 times, right? And so every rotation, every time I do this, it gets easier and more powerful. And that's kind of by definition what a flywheel effect does. And so, like in our program, we build this flywheel for people and we let them put the wedges in that makes the most sense for them and their goals. But one wedge that I can talk about in 60 seconds that will kind of drive home what I mean by relationship building on purpose. So, say, Gabe, you're on a podcast and you're like, this is a really good podcast for me. I feel like I had good resonance with the host. I know it's in, and most importantly, when I look at the list of all the other people that have been interviewed on this podcast, I start to see people that I would love to have relationships with. And so, what's really cool is when you have this one interview published, it sort of opens up this door to the cool kids club or the backstage pass. And it's like, oh, Dustin was on this show and John Meese was on this show and blah, blah, blah. Right. And so you cut, and maybe there's 200 people that have been interviewed now. All those people are available for you to reach out to. And because of the nature of podcasting, every week there's probably another new name on that list because it's an evergreen machine, basically, right? And so what we do is we will train a virtual assistant to actually do this. But just imagine that you're on a show, it's a high quality show for you and your market, and we go and look at every name on that guest list, which is all publicly available, and you can even listen if you wanted to. You don't need to, but you can go see what they're about, and you could say, oh, like every person on this list probably fits into one, two, or three buckets: potential client, potential partner, meaning like collaboration partner, peer, or a third would be platform. Oh, they have a podcast, they have a big Instagram following, they have a YouTube channel, right? And so now I can reach out to any of those individuals in a way that's very congruent, and I can say, hey, Gabe, you and I were both on Joe's podcast. Joe's awesome. Congratulations on being featured. I'd love to connect with you. We are typically doing that on LinkedIn, right? And that's where this kind of social media pseudo thing happens. You could do that via email, you can do that other places, but LinkedIn's a very convenient place to do that. And then how that conversation, that connection happens and how that conversation ensues depends on which bucket they're in, right? And so, and it depends on your sales process. Okay, and that's part of what we build out with our clients. But hopefully that gives some like tangible value for, man, how could one podcast unlock lots of relationship value that is not cold, is actually you're borrowing the credibility of being on the same show. You got the host thing, the host relationship to leverage with that. And you kind of imagine the sky's the limit. You start getting on like sizable shows with really cool guest lists, and I've got almost 11,000 followers on LinkedIn. Probably half of them have come from this process.
Mm,
So not from posting, from connecting with individual real
yeah.
people who I could like legitimately say we have something in common. I'd love to connect with you. And many of those people have become clients. So
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that strategy because what you were talking about is like the warm lead, right? Like now you
yes.
have that connection and it's easier to have a yes with that connection. So, yeah, that's great. And
Yeah.
I would say I've had guests on multiple times because we built that connection or we've done other types of collaborations or I've connected them with someone or like that strategy you were just talking about. I kind of do that with conferences sometimes. If I'm a
Yeah,
part of a
exactly.
conference, I look at all the contributors, all the speakers, and I'm like, oh, yep, I want to connect with that one, want to connect with that one. So,
Yeah. And when you
same
think
idea.
about them, you may think they could be a potential client, but probably at a conference, it's probably more, they could be a great collaboration partner, right? So maybe this
Mhm.
is a very easy sample. Like, say I do Facebook ads for food brands and I go get interviewed on this podcast. Well, if someone says they do Google ads for food brands and someone else does SEO for food brands, like those are very easy connections for me to be like, hey, I may have some referrals for you. We should talk and maybe do a joint workshop, or you just become referral partners. So it's not only about like sales, but it can be, right? And I've also had a lot of hosts who had me on and I'm talking about podcast guesting and kind of coaching them up on how they could use this strategy. They hit end at the end of the call and there's been no sales and they're like, we should talk more because I actually think I should be in your program. So I get sales simply by teaching and doing the thing with someone who understands kind of the general concept of what I'm talking about. And so anyone can do that. Like if you're an expert at your thing and you're a podcast on a relevant audience, by default that host is probably representation of their audience. So the host should be a referral partner, potentially a client, and they have a platform. And then every person on that list, not every, but almost every person on that list is going to have some sort of value in that way of one of those 3 buckets and sometimes all 3 buckets in one.
Yeah. I love it. Okay, last question.
Yeah.
I know I could talk your ear off about this all day long, but how do you track the ROI of podcast guesting? Are there any metrics that we should be paying attention to?
Yes. So you can be a super nerd, and I used to try to be a super nerd because I have an engineering background, and of course I want numbers. And so, like, you can be very granular, in other words. And for every show that you podcast guest on, you could have a custom landing page so that every time someone opts in to your email list from a show, you know exactly the lead source and you can put a UTM parameter. And every time they buy something from you, you can track it back. That is very technologically doable. I also think it's kind of ridiculous and it doesn't really fit the model of how relationship based marketing works, right?
Too much for me.
Um, so like when someone's in my program, the very first day as an exercise as a demonstration, I say like, "Hey Gabe, like tell us about what you're up to and your goals, and then like the best you can remember, talk about how we met." And then they're like, "Oh man, like I think I heard you on a podcast, but then I ran into you at this conference, and I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while. And at some point, I went to this workshop you hosted and ended up on your email list." And the reality of just the way that this type of work happens is it's very hard to have single source attribution.
Mhm.
And so the podcast guest opportunity is typically one piece of the flywheel that I was describing earlier, right? And so you can do what I described and you could be very granular with this tracking. Personally, what I do, if I'm on like a bigger show, I will create a custom landing page, probably because I have a custom lead magnet because it just speaks better to an audience to be like, I literally did create this just for this audience. We don't go through that trouble for almost any opportunity, but for a few, and for those, of course, we want to track like, oh, I got 5,000 leads from this one thing. But 95% of the time, it's the same landing page and close enough is good enough. And the way that we actually track the results are, more through just that, like the email list growth as a result of doing this week
Mhm.
by week, not necessarily podcast by podcast. Because again, any particular podcast, a whole philosophy that I believe and have seen in action is every time you do this, you're planting a new seed, like an opportunity seed or a relationship seed. And it might pop up like the day the thing publishes, you might very well get a client. And you can be like, I made $2,000. That was really good. Or it could pop up 3 months down the road after they connect with you on LinkedIn or after they come to a different workshop, or it could be 3 years down the road and it turns out to be this life changing unicorn relationship that kind of stayed dormant while you nurtured it, right? This idea of sowing and reaping. And so obviously this is like a whole thing for me, but so I try not to get hung up on direct attribution as much as I'd like to. But it's definitely, the ROI is definitely there. It's just a little hard to point to one single source and say that that created it in most cases.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And actually, that's a lot of relief for me. I don't know if it's a relief for everyone listening. I would assume so, because I am not the one who's like going to create all the landing pages and all the things. Like, I just don't got time for that,
Yeah.
nor do I care enough. As long as leads are coming in, I know they're coming from somewhere. So, yeah, I like seeing kind of what is the correlation. Is my list growing? Is my
Yeah.
business growing? Okay, it's coming from the things I've done, the seeds I've planted.
And there's leads, which is one wedge in that wheel. But
Hmm.
the thing that might actually be totally worth having done that podcast was meeting that host who invites you to be in their conference speaker or invites you to
Yeah,
do a webinar with for their audience, right? And it's like that didn't even have anything to do with the audience from that's just a relationship that came from it. And you have all these guests that we're doing, similar relationship building with. So it's just really hard to track back to a single source of truth. And at some point I became very comfortable with that, like you just said. And I'm like, unless it's like some crazy opportunity, I'm just not going to worry about it. So, I was on the Nathan Barry show recently, and to me, that was a really big opportunity. And I gave the same lead magnet I just gave to yours. Like, it's like, it's just part of the same pie, and I'm not
right.
worried about trying to figure out exactly where every person came from. So,
This is a really amazing strategy if you aren't ready for your own long form content. And even if you are, to actually get more visibility, because you're going to be in all the pockets and build those relationships and connections so that you can find that next place to connect, that next collaboration.